The heavy mahogany door of the estate's industrial kitchen didn't just close, it clicked shut with a deafening, terrifying finality. Charlotte froze, the damp dish towel slipping from her trembling hands. She had been sobbing quietly over the cold marble island, entirely convinced she was alone in the sprawling, 3-story fortress. But standing there in the shadows, slowly loosening his dark silk tie, was Arthur Sterling, the most feared, untouchable man in New York's criminal underground. He didn't yell. He didn't ask what she was doing awake at 3 a.m. He simply stepped into the dim light, his cold, piercing eyes locking on to the dark, swelling bruise on her cheek, and whispered a question that was about to ignite a bloodbath. "Who did that to you?" Charlotte Evans never intended to spend her mid-20s scrubbing dried blood out of imported Persian rugs. 2 years ago, she was a nursing student at NYU, living a quiet, unremarkable life. That all evaporated the night her father, William, lost $150,000 he didn't have at an underground poker game in Atlantic City. He hadn't just lost it to anyone. He had lost it to the Sullivan Syndicate, a ruthless faction of the Irish mob that controlled the docks and the debt collection rackets on the East Coast. To keep her father from ending up at the bottom of the East River, Charlotte made a deal. She dropped out of school, surrendered her savings, and took a highly specialized, highly dangerous job arranged by a shadow employment agency. She became a live-in maid at a secluded, heavily fortified estate in Sands Point, Long Island. The estate belonged to Arthur Sterling. At 34, Arthur was the undisputed head of the Sterling family, a rival Italian-American syndicate that had ruled New York's shadows for 3 generations. Taking a job in the home of the Sullivans' greatest enemy was a calculated risk. The Sullivans agreed to pause the interest on her father's debt, provided Charlotte handed over 70% of her exorbitant salary every Friday night. She was effectively a hostage, trading her freedom for her father's pulse. The Sterling estate was less of a home and more of a billionaire's military bunker. Surrounded by 12-foot wrought-iron fences, monitored by thermal cameras, and patrolled by men who wore tailored suits to conceal shoulder holsters, it was a place where silence was the most valued currency. The head housekeeper, a rigid, unsympathetic woman named Mrs. Gable, had given Charlotte only one rule on her first day. You are to be a ghost. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not look Mr. Sterling in the eye. You see nothing, you hear nothing, and you clean everything. For 8 months, Charlotte had followed that rule flawlessly. She learned the rhythms of the house. She knew to polish the sub-zero refrigerators before dawn, to use club soda on the upholstery in the billiard room where meetings got heated, and to disappear into the servants' quarters whenever a fleet of black Escalades rolled up the gravel driveway. She rarely saw Arthur Sterling. When she did, he was a fleeting, terrifying presence. He was a man carved from ice, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp aristocratic features and eyes the color of a winter sky. He moved with a predatory grace, always dressed in immaculate Brioni suits, projecting an aura of absolute authority. The few times they had occupied the same room, the air had grown thick and heavy, making it difficult for Charlotte to breathe. He had never spoken a word to her. She was just part of the furniture, until a rainy Tuesday night in late October. Charlotte's shift had ended hours ago, but sleep was impossible. Tomorrow was Friday, collection day. She was $2,000 short. An unexpected medical bill for her father's failing liver had eaten into her envelope of cash. Panicked, she had slipped out of the servants' quarters to dispose of the kitchen waste in the incinerator out back, hoping the cold air would clear her head. The service entrance at the back of the estate was a rare blind spot for the security cameras, shielded by a thick canopy of ancient oak trees. As Charlotte tossed the heavy trash bags into the chute, a hand clamped brutally over her mouth from behind. She screamed, but the sound was muffled against a leather glove. She was shoved hard against the damp brick wall of the estate, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Standing in front of her, dripping wet in a cheap trench coat, was Tommy Barnes. Tommy was a mid-level enforcer for the Sullivans. He was a vile, opportunistic man who smelled of stale beer and cheap cologne. "Hello, Charlie," Tommy sneered, his grip tightening on her arm. "Your old man tells me you're a little light this week. Now that's not going to work for Mr. Sullivan." "I have the rest on Monday," Charlotte gasped, trembling violently. "Please, Tommy, you're not supposed to be here. If Sterling's men catch you—" "Sterling's men are idiots," Tommy spat, stepping closer, invading her space. "I walked right through the east gate. Now you listen to me, you little brat. You get the money by tomorrow morning, or we cut off William's fingers. 1 for every 1,000 you owe." "I can't," Charlotte cried, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't have it." Tommy's eyes darkened. He pulled back his hand and struck her across the face with a sickening crack. The force of the blow sent Charlotte sprawling onto the wet pavement. Her cheekbone instantly flared with agonizing heat, her vision blurring. "Tomorrow, Charlie," Tommy whispered, kicking her side lightly before turning on his heel, "or your dad is dead." Tommy melted back into the shadows, leaving Charlotte alone in the freezing rain. Terrified, in pain, and utterly broken, she dragged herself up. She didn't go back to her small bedroom. She couldn't face the isolation. Instead, she let herself into the darkened, cavernous main kitchen of the estate, seeking the bizarre comfort of the one room where she had some semblance of control. The kitchen of the Sterling estate was a masterpiece of modern culinary design, gleaming white marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, and copper pots hanging from an overhead rack like silent bells. At 3:15 a.m., the only sound was the low, steady hum of the massive industrial refrigerator. Charlotte stood over the island, leaning her weight onto her palms. A bag of frozen peas, wrapped in a dish towel, was pressed against the right side of her face. The skin was already turning a violent shade of purple and black. She let out a choked, ragged sob. She was trapped. If she didn't get the money, her father would be mutilated, perhaps killed. If she asked for an advance from Mrs. Gable, questions would be asked. If she ran, the Sullivans would find her. There was no escape. The sheer weight of her despair crushed her, and she dropped her head onto the cold marble, weeping uncontrollably. She cried for her lost future, for her father's weakness, and for the suffocating terror of living under the thumb of monsters. She was so consumed by her grief that she didn't hear the soft footfalls on the Persian runner in the hallway. She didn't hear the creak of the floorboards. What she did hear was the sound of the door. Click! It was the heavy metallic thud of the deadbolt sliding into place. Charlotte gasped, her head snapping up. The bag of peas hit the floor, scattering across the imported tiles. Standing just inside the door, his hand still resting on the brass lock, was Arthur Sterling. He had clearly just returned from a job. His tailored suit jacket was discarded over one arm, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a sliver of scarred skin at his throat. He smelled faintly of rain, expensive scotch, and the sharp metallic tang of gunpowder. Charlotte's blood ran cold. The absolute rule of the house, never be seen, never be a bother, echoed in her mind. She scrambled backward, hitting the edge of the sink, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Sterling," she stammered, bowing her head quickly, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. "I apologize. I was just leaving. I'll clean the floor. I'm sorry." "Stop!" His voice was a low, resonant baritone that commanded immediate obedience. It wasn't loud, but it filled the cavernous room, leaving no space for argument. Arthur didn't move towards the exit. Instead, he tossed his jacket onto a nearby stool. His eyes, usually impassive and deadened by the violence of his world, were fixed intensely on her face. Or rather, on the side of her face she was desperately trying to hide. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Charlotte pressed her back against the sink, wishing she could melt into the stainless steel. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but running from Arthur Sterling was a death sentence. He stopped mere inches from her. The sheer size of him, the physical presence he commanded, was overwhelming. Charlotte squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the reprimand, waiting for him to fire her or worse. Instead, she felt the startlingly gentle touch of his knuckles against her uninjured cheek. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Charlotte opened her eyes. He was so close she could see the flecks of silver in his irises. Slowly, agonizingly, Arthur dragged his gaze from her eyes down to the massive, dark bruise swelling across her cheekbone. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Who did that to you?" he asked. The question wasn't a request for information. It was an extraction. "I bumped into a cabinet," Charlotte lied, her voice cracking. "It was clumsy of me. I'm sorry to have disturbed your evening, sir." Arthur's hand moved. His long, calloused fingers gently grasped her chin, tilting her head up so she couldn't break eye contact. "I have spent my entire life around violence, Charlotte," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name, and the sound of it on his lips sent a strange shiver down her spine. "I know what a cabinet door does to a face, and I know the exact dimensions of a man's handprint. So I will ask you one more time, who did that to you?" Tears spilled over her lashes. The walls were closing in. If she told him about Tommy Barnes, Arthur would know she was compromised. He would know she owed the Sullivans. In the Mafia world, a compromised servant was a dead servant. "Please," she whimpered, a fresh tear sliding down and stinging the bruised flesh. "Please, just let me go. It's my problem." "You are standing in my home," Arthur replied, his thumb lightly wiping the tear from her jawline. The tenderness of the gesture was entirely at odds with the lethal coldness in his eyes. "You eat my food. You sleep under my roof. Nothing that happens to you is your problem alone. A man who strikes what is under my protection has forfeited his hands." Charlotte broke. The dam she had built to survive the last 8 months shattered under the weight of his unyielding gaze. "It was Tommy Barnes," she choked out, the words tumbling from her lips in a panicked rush. "He's an enforcer for the Sullivans. My father owes them money. I send them my paychecks. He came here tonight. He said I was short." Arthur didn't blink. The mention of his fiercest rivals didn't seem to shock him, but something else did. His hand slowly dropped from her face. "Tommy Barnes came here?" Arthur asked, his tone shifting from quiet intimidation to a chilling, razor-sharp focus. "To this estate?" "Yes," Charlotte sobbed, wrapping her arms around herself. "By the incinerator. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring them here. I swear I didn't tell them where I worked. They must have followed me or found out from the agency. Charlotte, stop talking." She clamped her mouth shut. Arthur turned his back to her, resting his hands flat on the marble island. He stared at the blank wall for a long, heavy moment. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about the debt, or her father, or the bruise on her face. "The East Gate requires a biometric scan and a rolling 8-digit algorithmic code that changes every 12 hours, Arthur stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a general analyzing a battlefield. A low-level thug like Tommy Barnes doesn't hack military-grade security. He doesn't scale a 12-foot electrified fence without tripping an alarm." Arthur slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder at her. The terrifying realization of what he was saying washed over Charlotte. "Tommy Barnes didn't break in, Charlotte," Arthur said, his eyes narrowing into lethal slits. "Someone opened the door for him. Someone in my inner circle." The silence in the kitchen was suddenly deafening. Charlotte realized with a sickening twist in her stomach that her bruised cheek hadn't just exposed her own terrible secret. It had just uncovered a rat inside the Sterling family. Arthur reached into his trousers and pulled out a secure, encrypted phone. He dialed a single number, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's terrified face. "Wake the men," Arthur said into the receiver, his voice echoing in the cold kitchen like a death knell. "Lock down the estate. Nobody gets in, and absolutely nobody gets out." The moment Arthur Sterling ended the call, the atmosphere inside the sprawling Sands Point estate shifted. There were no blaring sirens, no flashing red lights. The Sterling syndicate operated with lethal discretion. Instead, there was a low, vibrational hum as the backup generators engaged, plunging the estate into a complete tactical lockdown. Heavy steel shutters, disguised as decorative wooden panels, seamlessly slid over the floor-to-ceiling windows. The biometric locks on every exterior door engaged with synchronized heavy clicks. Charlotte stood frozen against the marble kitchen island, her breath hitching in her chest. The bag of frozen peas lay melting on the floor, a puddle of water seeping into the grout. She had triggered a war. Arthur slipped his encrypted phone back into his tailored trousers. His demeanor had transformed entirely. The quiet, simmering intensity was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating machinery of a warlord preparing for battle. He picked up his suit jacket, not to put it on, but to drape it over his arm, revealing the dark leather shoulder holster and the matte black grip of a customized Sig Sauer P226 resting against his ribs. "Mr. Sterling, please," Charlotte whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "I didn't mean to—" "Quiet," Arthur commanded. It wasn't harsh, but it was absolute. He stepped toward her, his towering frame casting a long shadow under the recessed lighting. "You are no longer a maid in this house, Charlotte. As of right now, you are the sole witness to a catastrophic security breach. You don't leave my sight." He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned and strode out of the kitchen, expecting her to follow. Terrified of what would happen if she didn't, Charlotte hurried after him, her cheap rubber-soled work shoes squeaking faintly against the polished hardwood floors. They moved through the cavernous, darkened corridors of the ground floor. Shadows danced along the walls, illuminated only by the pale emergency lighting that had flickered to life. As they passed the grand foyer, Charlotte witnessed the terrifying efficiency of Arthur's empire. Men were materializing from the wings of the estate. These weren't the low-level street thugs Charlotte was used to seeing on the news. These were operators. She recognized Conrad Hayes, Arthur's terrifyingly calm underboss, striding down the sweeping dual staircase. Conrad was methodically racking the slide of an H&K MP5 submachine gun, his expression as casual as if he were pouring a cup of coffee. "Perimeter is sealed, boss," Conrad reported, falling into step beside Arthur without missing a beat. Infrared sensors show 0 thermal signatures in the tree line. If Barnes came through the east gate, he slipped out before the lockdown. "He had a window," Arthur replied, his voice clipped and precise. "Pull the logs from the Brevo access control system. I want to know exactly whose biometric profile authorized the east gate between midnight and 0300 hours. And Conrad? Yeah, boss? Bring Leo and Vincent to the war room. Confiscate their phones. Nobody communicates with the outside until I find the rat." Conrad's eyes flicked to Charlotte, lingering on her bruised face and her trembling posture before returning to Arthur. "Understood." Conrad peeled off towards the security hub, leaving Arthur and Charlotte to continue down the east wing. They reached a set of heavy, sound-proofed double doors made of solid oak. This was Arthur's private study, a room Mrs. Gable had strictly forbidden the staff from entering. The cleaning was done by a specialized, bonded crew. Arthur pressed his thumb to a concealed scanner on the doorframe. A green light flashed, and the heavy doors unlatched. He pushed them open and gestured for Charlotte to enter. The study smelled of aged leather, parchment, and Cohiba Behike cigars. Walls lined with first-edition books stretched up to a vaulted ceiling. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by 2 deep Chesterfield leather armchairs. "Sit," Arthur instructed, pointing to one of the armchairs. Charlotte obeyed, her legs practically giving out as she sank into the plush leather. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, curling into a protective ball. She felt entirely out of place, a girl in a faded grey uniform sitting in a room that dictated the fate of New York's underworld. Arthur walked behind his desk, but he didn't sit. He unlocked a bottom drawer and pulled out a tactical medical kit. He walked back around and crouched in front of her, his knees resting on the vintage Persian rug. "Look at me," he said softly. Charlotte slowly raised her head, flinching as his large, calloused hands reached for her face. But his touch was startlingly gentle. He opened a sterile alcohol swab. "This will sting," he warned, his voice a low rumble. He dabbed the antiseptic against a small cut that had formed beneath the massive bruise on her cheekbone. Charlotte hissed, her eyes watering. Arthur didn't apologize, but he slowed his movements, his eyes locked onto the injury with a dark, terrifying focus. "Tommy Barnes," Arthur said quietly as he applied a thin layer of arnica ointment to reduce the swelling. "A mid-level collector for the Sullivans. He has a rap sheet for aggravated assault and extortion. He operates mostly out of the docks in Red Hook. Is that who hit you?" Yes," Charlotte stammered. "My father. He has a gambling problem. He lost $150,000 at one of their card games." "And you've been paying it off," Arthur deduced, his jaw tightening. "With the salary I pay you." Charlotte nodded miserably. 70% of it. Every Friday. If I stop, they'll kill him. Arthur tossed the medical supplies back into the kit and stood up to his full height, looking down at her. "You let a rival syndicate extort you while living under my roof. You allowed a Sullivan enforcer to walk onto my property. By the laws of our world, Charlotte, I should put a bullet in your head right now." Charlotte let out a broken sob, burying her face in her hands. She had known this was coming. The penalty for bringing the enemy to the door was death. "But," Arthur continued, his voice cutting through her panic like a knife, "Tommy Barnes made a fatal miscalculation. He touched something that belongs to this house. He touched you." Charlotte's breath caught. She looked up through her fingers. Arthur Sterling was staring at her with an intensity that made her stomach flip. It wasn't pity in his eyes. It was absolute, territorial possessiveness. "No one bleeds on my property unless I order it," Arthur said, his tone chillingly calm. "And no one inside my walls is touched by a Sullivan. Your father's debt is no longer your concern. It is mine." Before Charlotte could process the sheer weight of what he was saying, a heavy knock echoed from the study doors. "Boss," Conrad's voice came through the heavy oak. "We have the logs. Leo and Vincent are in the war room." Arthur didn't break eye contact with Charlotte. "Stay in this chair. Do not move. Do not make a sound." He turned and strode out of the room, the heavy doors clicking shut behind him, leaving Charlotte alone in the dimly lit study, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The war room was located just down the hall from Arthur's study. It was a stark, windowless bunker equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance monitors, a long steel table, and soundproofing so dense it felt like a vacuum. When Arthur entered, the air was thick with tension. Conrad Hayes stood by the monitors, a tablet in his hand. Seated at the steel table were two of Arthur's most trusted lieutenants, Leo Gallagher, a broad-shouldered enforcer who managed the family's unions, and Vincent Boyle, a sharply dressed numbersman who oversaw the offshore accounts and digital security. Both men looked uneasy. Their phones sat in a plastic bin at the center of the table, a clear sign that they were under suspicion. Arthur didn't sit. He paced slowly behind the two seated men, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, designed to break their nerves. At 2:45 a.m., Arthur began, his voice devoid of inflection. A man named Tommy Barnes walked through the east gate of this estate. He bypassed the Cubba Mars X10 lock. He circumvented the thermal cameras. He assaulted a member of my household staff by the incinerator, and then he left. Leo's head snapped up, his thick neck flushing red. "A Sullivan? Here?" "Boss, I swear to God, if my men were on rotation—" "Your men weren't on rotation, Leo," Arthur interrupted smoothly, stopping right behind Vincent Boyle's chair. "The automated perimeter defense was active, which means someone inside this house manually overrode the security protocols." Vincent cleared his throat. He was a handsome man, usually oozing arrogance in his custom Tom Ford suits, but right now a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. "Arthur, the system is complex. It could have been a glitch in the Palantir network, or a remote hack." Arthur leaned down, resting his hands on the back of Vincent's steel chair. "Conrad," Arthur said softly, "read the logs." Conrad tapped the screen of his tablet. The east gate was opened using an authorized biometric thumbprint and a Level 4 clearance code. The system wasn't hacked. It was invited. He looked up, his eyes cold. The clearance code belonged to Vincent. The room erupted. "It's a setup," Vincent shouted, scrambling backward in his chair, trying to put distance between himself and Arthur. "Boss, you know me. I've been with your father since before you took over. The Sullivans must have cloned my credentials. It's a spoof." Leo jumped to his feet, his hand instinctively dropping to his waist, though his weapon had been confiscated at the door. "You piece of garbage," Leo spat at Vincent. "You sold us out to the Irish?" "Sit down, Leo," Arthur commanded. Leo slowly sank back into his chair, glaring daggers at Vincent. Arthur slowly walked around the table to face Vincent. The numbers man was hyperventilating, his eyes darting towards the locked door. "A biometric clone requires a physical mold of my thumbprint," Vincent pleaded, his voice cracking. "Someone lifted it, Arthur. I swear on my mother's life." "I believe you," Arthur said quietly. Vincent exhaled a massive sigh of relief, slumping back into his chair. "Thank God, Arthur. We need to sweep the staff. Someone lifted my print from a glass or a file." "I believe you didn't open the gate tonight," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper as he leaned over the table, bringing his face inches from Vincent's. "Because tonight you were in the East Wing, trying to crack the physical safe in my bedroom, while Barnes created a distraction." Vincent froze. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. "You thought I didn't notice the micro-abrasions on the dial of the Diebold safe last week?" Arthur asked, his eyes burning with a dark, violent fire. "You've been bleeding the offshore accounts, Vincent. You got into bed with the Sullivans to cover your losses in the crypto market. You gave Barnes access to the grounds so he could collect a measly debt from a maid, knowing the security sweep would focus on the perimeter, giving you exactly 15 minutes to access my private quarters." Conrad stepped forward, pulling a heavy, suppressed Glock 19 from his waistband and resting it on the table. The metallic clack echoed in the silent room. Vincent fell to his knees, his tailored suit trousers hitting the concrete with a thud. Tears streamed down his face. "Arthur, please, they were going to kill me. The Sullivans, they have leverage. I can fix the accounts. I can get the money back." "You compromised my home," Arthur stated, his voice devoid of pity. "You brought an enemy onto my soil. You put my people at risk." Arthur picked up the suppressed Glock. In the study down the hall, Charlotte jumped violently as a dull, muted thump echoed through the heavy oak doors, followed by the sickening sound of something heavy hitting the floor. She clamped her hands over her mouth, stifling a scream. She knew exactly what that sound was. The reality of the world she was trapped in crashed down upon her with crushing weight. Arthur Sterling wasn't just a strict employer. He was a judge, jury, and executioner. 10 minutes later, the study doors opened. Charlotte scrambled back into the depths of the leather chair, her heart pounding frantically. Arthur stepped into the room. He had removed his shoulder holster and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle and laced with old scars. There was a single, tiny speck of crimson blood on his crisp white cuff. He walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured 2 fingers of Macallan 25 amber liquid into a glass. He downed it in one smooth motion, his back to her. "The mole has been dealt with," Arthur said quietly, setting the glass down. Charlotte couldn't find her voice. She merely nodded, trembling. Arthur turned to face her. The lethal coldness from the kitchen had faded, replaced by an intense, heavy exhaustion. He looked at her bruised face, her terrified eyes, and the way she shrank away from him. "You're afraid of me," he stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, Charlotte whispered, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. Arthur walked slowly toward her, stopping just at the edge of the Persian rug. "You should be. The world I inhabit is entirely unforgiving. But understand this, Charlotte." He leaned down, placing a hand on the arm of her chair, trapping her in his gravity. "From this moment forward, you belong to the Sterling family," Arthur said, his voice a low, rough rumble that sent a flush of heat through her freezing veins. "Tommy Barnes will never touch you again. The Sullivans will never threaten your father again. Your debt is erased." Charlotte looked up into his silver eyes, entirely overwhelmed. "Why? Why would you do this for me?" Arthur's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "Because you bleed on my floor, Charlotte, and what happens in my house is my business. Now try to get some sleep. Tomorrow, we go to war with the Sullivans." Charlotte awoke to the unfamiliar scent of lavender and freshly pressed linen. She wasn't in the cramped, windowless servants' quarters located above the garage. She was in the East Wing, the secured, family-only sector of the Sands Point estate. The walls were draped in heavy, cream-colored silk, and the morning sun strained against the edges of the blackout curtains. A soft knock startled her. The door clicked open, and Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, stepped inside. The rigid, unsympathetic woman who had tormented Charlotte for 8 months now kept her eyes firmly pinned to the floor. She held a silver tray bearing a pot of Earl Grey tea, toast, and a folded set of clean, tailored clothes that clearly didn't belong to the staff uniform code. "Good morning, Miss Evans," Mrs. Gable said, her voice tight and trembling slightly. The sudden use of Charlotte's surname, rather than a sharp "girl," was jarring. "Mr. Sterling requested I bring you breakfast. When you are ready, he is expecting you in the solarium." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Charlotte murmured, pulling the heavy duvet up to her chin. "I was instructed to inform you that your father, William, has been relocated," Mrs. Gable added hurriedly, risking a quick, fearful glance at Charlotte's bruised face. "Mr. Hayes facilitated his transfer from his apartment in Queens to a private, secure medical facility in upstate New York at 4 a.m. He is under a 24-hour armed guard. The Sullivans cannot reach him." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest for 2 years instantly evaporated, replaced by a dizzying sense of disbelief. Arthur hadn't just made a promise in the heat of the moment. He had mobilized his men in the dead of night to secure her only living family member. 20 minutes later, dressed in a soft cashmere sweater and fitted trousers provided by Mrs. Gable, Charlotte navigated the labyrinthine halls towards the solarium. The atmosphere in the estate was unrecognizable. The quiet hum of a billionaire's retreat had been replaced by the focused energy of a military command center. Men in tactical gear, carrying matte black rifles, monitored the perimeter from the heavily tinted windows. Arthur was waiting for her in the glass-enclosed solarium overlooking the Long Island Sound. He was standing over a massive teakwood table strewn with architectural blueprints, satellite printouts, and digital tablets. Conrad Hayes and Leo Gallagher flanked him, their expressions grim and focused. When Charlotte entered, the conversation stopped. Leo and Conrad immediately straightened, offering her brief, respectful nods, a staggering shift in protocol. Arthur looked up, his silver eyes sweeping over her, lingering for a fraction of a second on the dark purple bruise blooming across her cheek before meeting her gaze. "Sit, Charlotte," Arthur said, gesturing to a wrought-iron chair beside him. She sat, feeling entirely out of her depth as she looked at the maps. They were marked with red ink, highlighting specific locations across the 5 boroughs. Declan Sullivan thinks he holds the city by the throat because he controls the ports, Arthur said, his voice cold and analytical, addressing his lieutenants but keeping his body angled toward Charlotte. He believes my father's old treaties still bind me. Last night, he sent a dog to my door. Today, we burn his kennels. Arthur pointed a silver pen at the map, laying out the tactical dismantling of the Sullivan Empire. He didn't shield Charlotte from the violence of his world. He was integrating her into it. The Sterling Syndicate's retaliation plan, *Target Alpha, the Hunt's Point Cooperative Market. Leo, the Sullivans use the meatpacking district to launder their extortion cash. At 2100 hours, you will seize their primary warehouse, burn the ledger books, confiscate the cash reserves, and break the knees of any Sullivan captain who draws a weapon. Leave the civilian workers untouched. *Target Bravo, the Red Hook Docks. Conrad, Declan's brother, Finnick Sullivan, is expecting a shipment of stolen European pharmaceuticals to dock at Pier 44 tonight. Intercept the shipment. Sink the container in the harbour. I want Finnick to watch it go down. *Target Charlie, the debt registry. Vincent's betrayal gave us a small window of opportunity. Before I executed him, his laptop revealed the Sullivans' digital debt registry, stored on a localized server in Hell's Kitchen. We are deploying a tactical team to destroy the server. Every dime owed to Declan Sullivan by the working class, including your father's debt, Charlotte, will be erased. Charlotte stared at the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. You're starting a war over me? She whispered, the sheer scale of the violence terrifying her. I am starting a war over disrespect, Charlotte, Arthur corrected softly, leaning down so his face was level with hers. You were simply the catalyst. The Sullivans have grown arrogant. Declan thought he could bleed my household, and I would look the other way to maintain the peace. He misjudged me. Boss, Conrad interjected, his tone cautious. Hitting 3 of their primary arteries in one night. Declan is going to unleash hell. He has corrupt cops on his payroll in the NYPD's 75th precinct. They might hit back with badges, not just bullets. Let them, Arthur replied, his eyes narrowing into lethal slits. If Declan sends a uniform to my gate, I'll buy the commissioner. The era of the Irish mob in New York ends this week. Prep the men. We strike at sundown. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the estate into a tense, suffocating darkness. Charlotte paced the length of Arthur's private study, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of untouched tea. The sprawling house was eerily silent. A skeleton crew of heavily armed guards patrolled the perimeter, but the bulk of Arthur's forces and Arthur himself were out in the city, executing the 3-pronged strike. Charlotte couldn't shake the terrifying memory of her past. She had been an NYU nursing student, trained to save lives, to stop bleeding, to heal. Now she was hidden away in a billionaire mobster's fortress, waiting to hear if the man who had brutally protected her would survive the night. At 11:42 p.m., the encrypted radio on Arthur's mahogany desk crackled to life. Command, this is Viper 1. Target Alpha is neutralized. Hunt's Point is ours. No casualties on our side. Charlotte released a breath she didn't know she was holding. Leo had succeeded. 10 minutes later, another transmission. Command, target. Charlie is dust. The servers are burned. The registry is gone. Her father was officially free. The debt that had ruined their lives, that had forced her into a life of servitude, no longer existed. Tears of relief pricked her eyes, but her relief was instantly shattered by a frantic, static-laced burst over the radio. Command, this is Echo Team at Red Hook. It's an ambush. Finnick Sullivan knew we were coming. They had heavy artillery waiting in the shipping containers. We are pinned down. The boss is hit. I repeat, Arthur is hit. The mug slipped from Charlotte's hands, shattering against the hardwood floor. Panic seized her throat. The sterile, controlled environment of the estate suddenly felt like a tomb. She rushed out of the study, nearly colliding with a tactical guard stationed in the hallway. "Get the medical bay ready!" Charlotte screamed, her dormant nursing instincts overriding her fear of the Mafia soldiers. "He's wounded! Clear the east entrance!" For the next 45 minutes, time dilated. Charlotte sprinted to the estate's underground medical wing, a fully equipped trauma room designed for emergencies the syndicate couldn't take to a public hospital. She sterilized instruments, prepped IV lines, and laid out trauma dressings, moving with a manic, hyper-focused energy. The sound of screeching tires echoed from the underground garage. Doors slammed. Men shouted. Conrad Hayes burst through the double doors of the medical wing, his suit jacket covered in blood. Behind him, 2 soldiers were supporting Arthur. The boss of the Sterling family looked impossibly pale, his lips pressed into a tight, grim line. His left hand was clamped over his right side, blood seeping through his fingers and staining his crisp white shirt a horrific crimson. "Put him on the table," Charlotte ordered, her voice slicing through the chaotic shouting of the men. Arthur's eyes, heavy with pain, snapped up to meet hers. Even bleeding out, his presence was overwhelming. He grunted as the men hoisted him onto the stainless steel trauma table. "Out," Arthur rasped, looking at his soldiers. "All of you, secure the perimeter." "Boss, you need a doctor," Conrad argued. "I said get out," Arthur roared, the exertion causing him to cough violently. The men didn't dare disobey. They filed out, leaving Charlotte entirely alone with the most dangerous man she had ever met. Charlotte grabbed a pair of surgical scissors and approached the table. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were focused. "I have to cut the shirt," she said, her voice dropping to a professional, steady tone. Arthur nodded once, releasing his grip on his side. Charlotte quickly sheared through the expensive fabric, pulling it away to reveal a deep, jagged bullet graze along his right obliques. It was bleeding heavily, but it hadn't penetrated the abdominal cavity. "It's a clean graze," Charlotte breathed, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over her. "The bullet didn't lodge, but it's deep. You need stitches, and you've lost blood." "Then stitch it," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. He didn't take his eyes off her face. Charlotte prepped a syringe of local anesthetic. As she leaned over him to inject the numbing agent, she was hyper-aware of his sheer size, the heat radiating from his skin, and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of his heart beneath her wrist. "Finnick knew we were coming," Arthur stated quietly, as she began to clean the wound with iodine. He didn't even flinch as the burning liquid touched his raw flesh. "Vincent wasn't the only leak. Declan Sullivan has someone else inside my organization." Charlotte paused, the bloodied gauze in her hand. "Who?" "I don't know yet," Arthur murmured, his silver eyes tracking the movement of her hands. "But I will find them, and I will skin them alive." He reached up, his large, blood-stained hand gently grasping her wrist, stopping her movements. The contrast between the violent words he just spoke and the tender way he touched her made Charlotte's breath hitch. "You're shaking," Arthur observed softly. "You're bleeding on my floor," Charlotte replied, echoing his words from the night before, a faint, nervous smile touching her lips. Arthur's eyes darkened, the intensity in them entirely eclipsing the pain of his wound. He pulled her wrist slightly, forcing her to step closer, until her hips were pressed against the edge of the cold steel table. "You saved my father," Charlotte whispered, the emotional weight of the last 24 hours finally breaking through her professional facade. "You burned their records. You risked your life. For a maid." "You are not a maid," Arthur corrected, his thumb tracing the pulse point on her wrist. "Not anymore. You are mine to protect, Charlotte. And God help the man who tries to take you from me." The air in the trauma room grew unbearably thick. The war outside the fortified walls of the estate raged on, but inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights, a different kind of surrender was taking place. Charlotte didn't pull away. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, terrifyingly safe. The next 48 hours within the Sands Point estate were a blur of tactical maneuvers, whispered commands, and the metallic clatter of fresh magazines being loaded into Heckler and Coke assault rifles. Arthur Sterling, running on sheer willpower and heavy doses of the antibiotics Charlotte administered, refused to remain in the medical bay. He converted the solarium into a heavily guarded war room, his stitched side tightly bound beneath a fresh, custom-tailored Brioni vest. Charlotte had officially transitioned from invisible staff member to the most protected woman in New York. Two of Arthur's most elite personal guards, silent men who moved like shadows, were stationed outside her bedroom door. But the safety of the estate felt like an illusion. The knowledge that a second traitor breathed the same filtered air kept Charlotte's nerves strung tighter than piano wire. The breakthrough didn't come from Vincent's decrypted files or a tortured Sullivan enforcer. It came from a simple, terrifying slip of the tongue. It was Thursday evening. The sky above Long Island was the color of bruised iron, promising a brutal storm. Charlotte was in the main kitchen, brewing a pot of black coffee for the men in the solarium. Leo Gallagher, Arthur's broad-shouldered enforcer, pushed through the swinging doors. He looked exhausted, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, exposing a heavy Rolex Daytona on his thick wrist. "Make it strong, Charlie," Leo grunted, leaning heavily against the marble island. "We're heading out to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in an hour. Declan Sullivan finally agreed to a sit-down. Boss is going to end this tonight." Charlotte nodded, keeping her eyes on the French press. "Is Conrad going with him?" "Yeah, Conrad, me, and a dozen shooters," Leo replied, rubbing his jaw. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Crazy week, huh? From scrubbing floors to having your old man stashed away in that private clinic up in Poughkeepsie. You must be relieved." Charlotte's hand froze mid-pour. The scalding coffee splashed onto the marble, narrowly missing her skin. She didn't look up immediately. Her mind raced, piecing together the timeline with terrifying clarity. When Arthur had ordered William Evans moved to a secure facility, he had given the command to Conrad Hayes in the middle of the night. Charlotte had been in the room. Only Arthur, Conrad, and Mrs. Gable, who had delivered the message the next morning, knew the location. Leo Gallagher had been busy securing the perimeter. He was never told where William was taken. No one was supposed to know the name of the town, let alone that it was Poughkeepsie, unless they had intercepted the encrypted communications, or unless they were feeding that information to the Sullivans to use as leverage later. "Yes," Charlotte said, forcing her voice to remain steady, very relieved. She handed Leo the tray of coffee cups. The moment the kitchen doors swung shut behind him, Charlotte broke into a dead sprint. She bypassed her guards, rushing down the East Wing corridor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She burst into Arthur's private study without knocking. Arthur was strapping a Sig Sauer into his shoulder holster, wincing slightly as the leather pressed against his stitches. Conrad was beside him, checking the action of a compact submachine gun. Both men snapped their attention to her, instantly alarmed by her pale face. "Charlotte!" Arthur stepped forward, his protective instincts flaring. "What's wrong?" "It's Leo!" Charlotte gasped, grabbing the lapels of Arthur's vest. "Arthur, it's Leo Gallagher. He just told me he knew my father was in Poughkeepsie." "You never told him that. He shouldn't know where the clinic is." The temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero. Conrad slowly lowered his weapon, his eyes widening as the realization hit him. "Boss, Leo volunteered to sweep the comms room after we found Vincent. He had full access to the encrypted routing logs. If he gave Declan the Poughkeepsie address, then this sit-down at the Navy Yard isn't a negotiation," Arthur finished, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating baritone. "It's an execution. Declan expects me to walk into a kill box, thinking my right flank is secure, only for Leo to put a bullet in the back of my head." Arthur didn't rage. He didn't shout. The terrifying calm of the predator returned to his silver eyes. He looked down at Charlotte, his large hands coming up to cup her face. "You just saved my life, Charlotte," he whispered, pressing a fierce, searing kiss to her forehead. "Again." He turned to Conrad. "Change the logistics. We don't confront Leo here. It will cause a panic among the men. We take him to the Navy Yard. But we flip the board on Declan Sullivan." 2 hours later, the storm broke over Brooklyn, unleashing a torrential downpour upon the rusting shipyards. Arthur's fleet of black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagons rolled into the abandoned warehouse district, headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. Inside the cavernous, leaking warehouse, Declan Sullivan stood waiting. He was surrounded by heavily armed Irish enforcers, his face twisted into an arrogant sneer. Arthur walked through the rusted bay doors, flanked by Conrad and Leo. To anyone watching, it looked like a standard Mafia parley. "Arthur," Declan called out, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel roof. "You look a bit pale. Heard my brother gave you a scratch at Red Hook. A minor inconvenience, Declan," Arthur replied smoothly, stopping 20 paces away. "I came here to accept your surrender." Declan laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "My surrender? You're standing in my territory, surrounded by my men, and your own house is crumbling from the inside." Declan looked past Arthur. "Isn't that right, Leo?" Leo stepped out from behind Arthur's right shoulder, drawing his weapon. But before the heavy barrel of his gun could even clear his hip, Arthur spun with terrifying, liquid speed. Despite his injury, Arthur's movements were a blur of calculated violence. He didn't draw a gun. Instead, he drove the blade of a tactical knife, concealed in his sleeve, deep into the nerve cluster of Leo's gun arm. Leo screamed, dropping his weapon as his arm went entirely numb. Before Leo's gun hit the concrete, Conrad's MP5 submachine gun was already up, aimed directly at Declan Sullivan's chest. At the exact same moment, the shadows of the warehouse catwalks above them moved. Arthur hadn't walked into a trap. He had brought his own. 24 Sterling snipers who had infiltrated the Navy Yard an hour earlier, based on Arthur's altered logistics, activated their laser sights. Dozens of red dots painted Declan Sullivan and his men in a deadly, inescapable constellation. "You thought you could buy my loyalty, Declan?" Arthur's voice boomed through the warehouse, cold and absolute. "You bought a ghost, and now you are out of time." The shootout was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. When the smoke cleared, the Sullivan Syndicate was nothing more than a memory staining the concrete floor of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Leo Gallagher, bleeding and whimpering, was dragged away by Arthur's men to face the slow, agonizing justice of the Sterling family. By dawn, the war was over. When Arthur returned to the Sands Point estate, the morning sun was just breaking over the Long Island Sound. He was exhausted, battered, and covered in the dust of the city. Charlotte was waiting for him in the ground foyer. She didn't care about the blood on his coat or the terrifying violence he had just orchestrated. She saw only the man who had torn down an empire to protect her. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest. Arthur caught her with a sharp intake of breath, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor. "It's over," Arthur murmured into her hair, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "They will never touch you again. You are safe. You are mine." "Yours," Charlotte whispered back, pressing her lips to his jawline, fully embracing the beautiful, dangerous monster she had fallen in love with. The invisible maid was gone. In her place stood the untouchable queen of the Sterling Empire. The thrilling saga of Charlotte and Arthur proves that true power isn't just about ruling the underworld. It's about the lengths a man will go to protect the woman who unexpectedly steals his heart. From a terrified maid hiding a bruise to the strategic queen of a mafia empire, Charlotte's journey is a testament to survival, loyalty, and a love forged in the fires of betrayal. The Sterling and Sullivan war may be over, but the passion and danger of their world will last forever. Did Arthur's ruthless loyalty leave you completely breathless? If you loved the intense twists, the high-stakes betrayal, and the undeniable chemistry in The Maid Was Crying in the Mafia boss's kitchen, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this gripping story with your fellow romance and mafia drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more dark, thrilling, and romantic audio stories every single week. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a dramatic chapter. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite plot twist? See you in the next story.